Thank you very much, David. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to speak to this very broad and diverse group of partners in the risk management process, and to take some time today to reflect on this very challenging area that does take us beyond the traditional paradigm for medicines regulation to opening up our eyes to a broader healthcare systems perspective. And I'm sure we have a lot to learn from that broader perspective. So I'm going to take us back from the detail a little bit to consider where all of this fits into the regulatory framework. So my presentation is a little bit broader. It's looking at the identification of preventable adverse drug reactions, and very much from a regulatory perspective. So in that context, I'll briefly remind us of the role of the regulator, how we take action on drug safety issues, and one of the objectives of the new legislation, which is to strengthen the link between safety assessment and regulatory action, and also just introduce the topic and concept of preventability, and perhaps to focus more on what would be our goals for risk management. So in terms of the role of the regulator, we know it's to promote and protect public health. We're both the gatekeeper and the enabler. A focus for us is clearly that effective medicines are made available to patients to meet patient need, but also that we have post-marketing systems and actually risk management systems in the peri-authorization period that allow us to plan to manage risk and to promptly detect risks and to manage them throughout the life cycle. A key priority is to ensure that we have as much information to patients and healthcare professionals on benefits and risks, and that this information is made available right throughout the product's life cycle. One of the areas brought into focus by the new pharmacovigilance legislation is that we need to do more than have risk management plans in place. We need to do more than ensure that the product information is kept up to date. We really need to aim to demonstrate that risk has been effectively managed. And that's very challenging, but it's the aspiration. In terms of the overall approach for medicines regulation, we're clearly trying to optimize the benefits and minimize the risks. So we accept that no effective medicine is without risk, and our goal is to maximize the benefit-risk margin through effective risk minimization and optimization of the use of medicines. As colleagues mentioned yesterday, the tool of risk management plans has been introduced for a number of years, and there is more proactivity ensured through this approach, but we do need to continue to ensure that these risk management plans are effective in delivering on their goals. Clearly, we're not alone in this process. We have partners, and you're here today in the room. We recognise that it's through a process of dialogue and collaboration that we all have the best chance to achieve our goals in optimising drug safety and ultimately in improving health outcomes. So we're seeking to do this through a process of collaboration, and I think some of the colleagues emphasised yesterday the point of engagement, that transparency is one step, but real engagement, particularly with patients, is an area that we continue to strive to do better. In terms of ensuring the safe and effective use of medicines, this is the broad goal. But if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, you see the criteria against which marketing authorization holders are assessed. So it's very much focusing on the product, on the dossier. At the time of initial approval of a marketing authorization, we have a very good understanding of the molecule, its pharmacology. But when we all understand that when the medicine is used in a broader population, less intensive monitoring, in a less carefully selected patient population, we fully anticipate greater variability in patient response. But there's also this other right-hand side of the slide, this area of medicines use in practice that we've already touched on this morning, the medication use process. And there are many actors in this process: the prescriber, the pharmacist, the nurse, the patient, and all of these clearly impact on health outcomes. So in terms of the bridge between the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the slide, we would see an important role for pharmacovigilance and risk management. And this just reminds us all of the processes for pharmacovigilance. We collect and analyse data, and over time the science of pharmacovigilance has developed. Pharmacovigilance systems have evolved to put a greater focus on methods in pharmacoepidemiology, but remembering that the cornerstone is the spontaneous reporting system. detecting and managing signals. And there's quantitative aspects to this, but there are clearly qualitative aspects that are very important in terms of the current discussion on medication errors. Collecting data is of no benefit unless we can analyse it, and analysing it meaningfully in a way that means that the output of the analysis influences how medicines are used in practice and deliver on health outcomes. Benefit risk assessment. We need to look at safety issues in the context of therapeutic benefit, appreciating that no effective medicine is without risk. And we have this dual role in terms of ensuring that effective medicines are available, but that harms are prevented. Regulatory action. There's no point in analysing the data unless the output of that assessment leads to meaningful updates to product information, proactive communication to patients, healthcare professionals, and that this information is accessible to healthcare systems. So proactivity in terms of communication is important. And finally, the new legislation poses the question, how are we checking that the measures are effective? So in terms of the new paradigm for medicines regulation that is more outward looking, that appreciates that the story doesn't end with the dossier, and that we need to consider not just the drug, the disease, the patient population, but also the environment for use of the medicine, the human factors, the system-related aspects that contribute to health outcomes in practice, and particularly preventability of harms. It means that we need an open-mindedness in terms of the spectrum of evidence that we need to consider in making judgments on how medicines are performing in real medical practice. And the thinking is that we appreciate the whole spectrum of evidence and that we look at it critically, taking into account data stores, the design of a study, but also what the individual piece of data contributes to our overall understanding. So for example, a single medication error report may actually prompt us to an issue that needs to be addressed through an improvement in the product information, the labelling, in how the medicine is used in practice. Reflecting on one of the examples from Spanish colleagues yesterday, I think it was 2 reports of medication error that led to improvements in the medication use process. So I think we need an open mind and a slightly different perspective than we would have had traditionally in terms of appreciating this full spectrum of evidence if we really want to achieve our goal of being relevant to clinical practice in the broadest sense. So in terms of the objectives of the pharmacovigilance legislation, those of you in this room know these all too well, but there are particular aspects that I'd like to flag up in the context of this particular discussion. One of the objectives is to ensure that there's a better link between assessment and regulatory action, and that's important. Increased proactivity and planning, that's easy to say, but we have to make that part of our routine work, looking to the future, responding to drug safety issues efficiently and in a proportionate way, and prioritising, engaging patients and healthcare professionals, and providing better information on medicines, balanced information on medicines, and timely information on medicines that's relevant to the needs of healthcare professionals and patients. And clearly we are partners in this process. The role of the pharmaceutical industry is key, the role of the healthcare professionals, the patients, the academics, the patient advocacy groups, the researchers, the scientists and academics. All of us are working together towards a common goal. So going back to the regulatory perspective, a key objective is to strengthen the link between safety assessment and risk management. That is something that we're really working hard to ensure. And if you think back to the earliest development and establishment of pharmacovigilance systems, we've come a long way. We now have sophisticated systems for data collection and analysis. Pharmacovigilance as a science has very much developed. The focus on methodology and pharmacoepidemiology means that our risk assessments are better informed. And robust risk characterisation is clearly a success factor for effective risk minimisation. We need to understand the risk before we can manage it. But if you do look back to this Lancet publication in 1961 that all of you will be familiar with, it's worth reflecting on the question posed here by Dr. McBride. Have any of your readers seen similar abnormalities in babies delivered of women women who've taken this drug during pregnancy. It was the clinical concern posed in this report, asking a question. And we must remember that while we make advancements in terms of methodologies and in the science, that the cornerstone of pharmacovigilance systems was and remains the observant healthcare professional, and that contribution to healthcare delivery, but also to the detection of signals remains at the core. So there is a qualitative aspect to all of this that we need to remain conscious of. And following that point, pharmacovigilance starts in the member states. The member states are close to the populations they serve. They understand the healthcare systems. They have insight into how medicines are used in their patient populations and the needs of those patient populations. So I think bearing in mind that it starts with clinical concerns in the member states, we have to appreciate that this is a network effort. There are diverse approaches, and these are complementary and add value. And the efforts now are to coordinate these so that all of European citizens can benefit from these experiences, but bearing in mind that there may be national initiatives that are tailored to particular national patient safety priorities. So it is acknowledging that patient safety is broader than medicines regulation, and it is a network effort to achieve effective risk minimisation through pharmacovigilance, but the patient safety perspective is broader. In terms of how these clinical concerns that are picked up at national level, they feed into the Vigilance database, and clearly that's a really important network tool. It's incredibly important with these really high numbers of reports that we have effective systems for quantitative and qualitative signal detection, and that we can encompass a diversity of approaches to ensure that we, as efficiently as possible, pick up drug safety signals. And there is evidence that the use of these new quantitative approaches and new vigilance signal detection methods in particular allow us to detect drug safety issues earlier. We need to explore this further for areas such as medication or in terms of bringing the national experiences and making the link between assessment and regulatory action, the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee clearly has an important role and a responsibility for signal management. The PRAC prioritises according to the available information, strength of evidence and public health context, and that public health focus is critical. Where appropriate, signals are escalated to a formal EU safety referral. So that's to ensure that there's a legally binding outcome that's implemented in a harmonised way across the member states so that all EU citizens can benefit from the updated risk minimisation measures, changes to product information package leaflets. And the activity of the PRAC is reflected in the agendas and minutes. So it's a big move towards increased transparency. Going back again to this link between safety assessment and regulatory action, and also the expansion of the medicines regulation outlook towards more broadly encompassing the focus on safe and effective use of medicines. As colleagues have emphasised yesterday, there are no caveats around the definition any longer in relation to normal conditions of use. So it's reflecting that harms from any use of a medicine need to be managed. And I think that's the simple message. We're looking at all harms from the use of a medicine. We can have very complicated discussions around terminology, but I think that is the guiding principle. We need to understand those harms. We need to understand what are product related and which relate to medication use processes, and bring the right skills and expertise and understanding of healthcare systems to ensure that we get timely, effective and proportionate risk management. In terms of the tools from a regulatory perspective, the new legislation gives us new and important legal tools, and we need to apply these wisely and effectively. But some of the routine procedures are the new EU referrals. So we now have efficient tools that allow us to do focused reviews of drug safety issues to, in a predictable way, deal with issues in a harmonised way across Europe. The signal management process now is coordinated at European level. So that means that we can leverage on all of the activities being undertaken throughout the European network, striving towards harmonised approaches. Risk management plans, as I said, it's an increased focus on proactivity. And finally, we have periodic safety update reports. So these are reports that are submitted at intervals throughout the product life cycle that provide cumulative information on risks and benefits, and particularly report on medication errors. And that would include the company's knowledge of near misses. So it would allow that cumulative picture to come into play. And of course, regulators would supplement this with the knowledge that they may receive through various collaborations with patient safety organisations. So again, it's very much a partnership approach. So I'll very briefly touch on the concept of preventability, and this is clearly complex and there are no easy answers, but what might help us to move the debate forward is to think about what we do have in common, where do our perspectives overlap, and what is our common goal in relation to effective risk management. So as we know, and I'm not going to go into the detail on this, but the point is to highlight that both the frequency of ADRs resulting in harm varies across the literature. It depends on the definition used. Clearly, the study design, the patient population, we'll see differences in ambulatory care in hospitals, and we'll see differences in regions. But the key point to highlight in these particular publications is that they highlight that a proportion are avoidable. So the UK suggestion was 72% in this publication. I've just picked a number of illustrative examples. It's in no way exhaustive. Germany, preventable cases in this particular study was suggested to be 20%. A local team in Ireland highlighted the fact that there's wide variability in the reported figures for preventability of ADRs in the literature, and they quote that it ranges from 3.9% to 92%. So that's a very wide variability in how individual researchers report preventability of ADRs, and clearly part of that is how it's defined. So you could follow the logic there that literature suggests there's no common understanding of the concept of preventability. And I very much enjoyed Professor Aronson's presentation yesterday in relation to circular definitions on adverse reactions. I guess it's even more so true for preventability. The conclusion I got to after reading a lot of papers was that it's preventable if we can prevent it. So that's a difficult starting point for a useful definition. So it is a difficult area. There are different perspectives, and I'm sure the perspective in clinical practice where you have information that allows you to do root cause analysis, you have a different perspective than I do sitting in my office in Earlsfort Terrace. So we have to understand that there are different perspectives in relation to classifying particularly individual reports as preventable. And the judgment of the reporter and the information that they provide in their report is obviously critically important. Sabine Brosh reminded us yesterday of the MEDRA guidelines and their advice on not inferring a medication error. So harms that may be preventable, we could debate this. Are they harms from medication errors? Well, then that depends on how you define a medication error. Are harms from intentional abuse or misuse preventable? Intentional overdose, we might consider, would be preventable. Unintended occupational exposure, should that always be preventable? Drug quality problems. So these are thoughts we could debate, and they're important. I know in certain healthcare systems there is the concept of never events, that there are just some harms that we should always strive to avoid. We accept that no medicine is without risk, but there may be areas that we could prioritise for focused and targeted approaches in order to learn from experiences, to really develop strategies that would prevent avoidable harms. So in order to get beyond the discussion around terminology and to acknowledge openly that there are different perspectives, perhaps we should think about what are our common risk management goals. And that's the approach we've taken in EU pharmacovigilance. We've very much focused on what are we doing in terms of risk minimisation activities. And European guidelines, for example, Module 5 on risk management systems, defines a risk minimisation activity as a public health intervention intended to prevent or reduce the probability of the occurrence of an adverse reaction. So it's to prevent or reduce the probability of an adverse reaction, or to reduce its severity should it occur. Okay, so that's how it's been defined in EU guidance. And the slides want a moment to pause. So in terms of how we structure our thinking as regulators and how the pharmaceutical industry approaches this, at the time of initial marketing authorization, we will be thinking in a very evidence-driven way about what is known about the risks of a product, and then saying what is not known. And we generally consider this in terms of the drug, the target population, and the disease. And the framework for looking at this is a safety specification. So in simple terms, the safety specification says what are the important identified risks, what are the important potential risks, and what is the important missing information. And it considers how this is in relation to the knowledge of the drug, the target population, and the disease, and the interplay between these. So in terms of our guidelines and what we do as regulators, so already at the initial marketing authorization stage, we're thinking about the potential for harms from overdose. So the companies pay special attention to medicinal products where there's an increased risk of harm for overdose, and whether that's intentional or accidental. There'll be particularly focus on this for medicinal products where there is a narrow therapeutic index, or where there might be, it's used in a patient population where there might be an inherent risk of overdose. And we heard some examples yesterday, but goes beyond that. We'll also think from the very time of initial marketing authorization, and clearly this is something we consider right throughout the life cycle, because the experience in the clinical trials will always only allow you to judge so much clearly, particularly for something like medication errors, but it will be considered upfront in the risk management plan. Also, there will be consideration of the potential for misuse for illegal purposes. So all of these kind of considerations, and I'm only providing a few illustrative examples, but it's just to highlight that already at the time of marketing authorization, we're looking at the available data and considering what might be the harms, particularly from a theoretical basis, but also learning from the experience with other similar pharmaceutical forms, similar medicinal products, and previous learnings, even on the pharmacological class. Then if we look at how we continue to update our knowledge of medication errors post-marketing, there is within the periodic safety update report a report provided by the company, and this is supplemented with information from other data sources. So if we think about this approach within the risk management plan, and indeed within the PSURs, we encourage structured risk characterisation and see this as a success factor for effective risk minimisation. Now, what is possible here will clearly vary according to the data source. If you're talking about data from spontaneous reports versus pharmacoepidemiological studies, etc., when we're looking at the risk itself, patient characteristics relevant to the risk, for example, age, and we had much discussion around that yesterday, particularly in relation to medication errors. We would be considering it more broadly in terms of variability in response in the safety specification, pregnancy, lactation, disease severity, hepatic renal impairment, relevant comorbidities, genetic polymorphisms. There'll also be consideration of product-related issues like dose, route of administration. Then in terms of the ADR, we might think about the risk period. We'll think about whether the duration of treatment. One of the key aspects that are relevant to this discussion, preventable ADRs, is the predictability of the adverse drug reaction. We're interested clearly in harms arising from the use of a medicinal product, and in terms of mitigating harm, the ability to monitor for sentinel adverse reaction or laboratory marker is clearly important. And then reversibility is an important issue, because again, we're making the distinction between harms and risks here. So in terms of the risk minimisation plan, safety specification feeds a pharmacovigilance plan, and I think my colleague Sabine Strauss will elaborate on that further. But I'm just going to highlight the risk minimisation plan. And in our regulatory framework, we think about routine risk minimisation and additional risk minimisation. In simple terms, routine risk minimisation is mainly about product information, and additional risk minimisation activities is something that goes beyond that. And we need to think very carefully about how we use these tools, because they're not neutral in terms of their impact on the patient and on the healthcare system. So we need to make sure that they're tailored, that they're designed taking account of best evidence on the risk, that they have clear goals and objectives, and also that they are tailored and adapted to healthcare systems. So some scenarios. I'm just going to highlight some of the examples, and I'll do this in a very top-line way. The detail of the examples isn't important, it's more the concepts. One of the points that I'd like to pick up on that David Cousins raised yesterday is that it's not always about picking up new signals, that there's a real issue with ensuring that the risk minimisation measures that we put in place and that we collectively put in place, not just as regulators, but collectively as all of the partners in the risk management process, have a sustainable effect, and that the measures we put in place are effective. So continuously we're challenged by new information on previously known risks and actually seeing harms from these risks. So you need concerted multidisciplinary, multi-agency approaches to dealing with these, and some of these are probably best addressed through initiatives at a national level, competent authorities working with other stakeholders to ensure that the regulatory recommendations translate into clinical practice, clinical actions, but very importantly, the intended health outcomes, preventing harms. So this is just an example of an initiative in Ireland where we have worked with risk managers in hospitals, clinical leads in the health service executive, to communicate nationally on the risk of unintentional overdose due to medication errors with oral methotrexate. This was also supported by the regulator of the pharmacy profession, who provided, at the same time as the IMB communicated on the product-related issues, they communicated on the practice-related issues. And this kind of collaboration has been facilitated through a medication safety forum that was established in Ireland by the Health Ministry as a multi-agency stakeholder group to explore medication safety issues and report recommendations. And I suppose the key value of this type of initiative is that it allows us to bridge between the regulatory recommendations and translating those into to clinical practice. And representatives from this group are in this room, and it's excellent that EMA is giving the opportunity at a European level to bring all interested stakeholders together to working towards a common goal. Just to highlight again, we can do these things at national level in terms of pushing out the communications, but product information really is regulated at European level now. Most nationally authorised products are under PDCP, and we have clearly a lot of centralised products, and changes to product information are coordinated at European level, and that makes a lot of sense because we want common standards for risk management so that all EU citizens can benefit from these scientific assessments. And here is an example in relation to methotrexate, where the Pharmacovigilance Working Party came up with common risk minimisation measures for product information to be implemented in a harmonised way across the EU member states. And this can be this can be built on through national communications. Another example where there has been efforts at European level to coordinate risk minimisation strategies was in relation to the use of intravenous paracetamol products, where there was identified through routine pharmacovigilance a risk of overdosing errors in infants, resulting in overdose with serious outcomes. This is clearly a really important public health issue, and there were coordinated efforts at European level following a very careful assessment to ensure that risk minimisation measures were pushed out through all the member states. And this is just an example that in Ireland, we as a regulator issued drug safety newsletters, and then the company clearly has an important role in pushing out information also. Another example would be the wrong route of administration, and I think David Cousins picked up on this example yesterday. It was Velcade and administration via the intrathecal route. Small numbers of reports, but clearly there are learnings from other experiences with inadvertent intrathecal administration of chemotherapy, and the environment for use here is important, and the risk minimisation measures were agreed and formally became a condition of the marketing authorization for the line extension. So this is ensuring that there is clarity in relation to the minimum measures that need to be taken at national level in relation to product risk management, and that's important. Another example is in relation to product confusion or inadvertent switching between different pharmaceutical forms with different posology. And the example here are immunosuppressants, it's tacrolimus. So clearly very important medicines, but very serious consequences to underdosing or overdosing. And there were reports of graft rejection, which led to the implementation of risk minimisation measures, a DHPC to specialists, general practitioners and pharmacists, a very important role for patient organisations here in pushing out the information, modified product information, a whole range of changes to the SPC and package leaflet, changes to the label, and clearly that's really very important for medication error, and then follow up in terms of pharmacovigilance activities. The last example that I'll very briefly mention is this example with fibrin sealants, and here was again in relation to the administration of the product and the need for clarity in relation to the pressure that should be used for the application of the spray, and also the proximity to the wound. So again, important risk minimisation measures that are product related. So in terms of how we consider effectiveness of risk minimisation, a starting point before we start looking at how the product is being used is to look at the clarity of the message in the product information. Does it have an actionable message? Do we have the risk characterisation that we would need to come up with a clear, actionable message? Do we need to collect further data? Do we need to liaise with particular experts with knowledge of healthcare systems? Is it sufficient to influence clinical actions? What is the limiting factor? Is it message clarity, or is it tools for delivery? How do we make our information accessible? How do we get the information in SPCs out to the point of healthcare delivery? How do we do the same for DHPCs? Is the risk sufficiently characterised to consider process indicators as a reasonable proxy for outcome indicators? Sometimes that might be the case, but we're focusing on preventing harms or focusing on health outcomes. Sometimes it's very predictable. If a certain behaviour is followed, we can predict that the harms will be prevented. We need a fit-for-purpose pharmacovigilance plan to inform risk minimisation and to avoid preventable harms. And we can ask which harms are preventable, or else we can say, what does success look like for an effective risk management plan? So in terms of our conclusions, effective risk minimisation is a shared goal. Supporting the provision of the right drug at the right dose, at the right time, to the right patient and with the right monitoring and information is something that medicines regulators cannot ensure without working in partnership with all of you. Analysis and an understanding of data collected is critical in defining risk minimisation strategies. From a regulatory perspective, a good risk characterisation is the starting point for defining a risk minimisation plan. New legislation increases the focus on real-world use of the medicine and preventing harms from medication errors, unintentional overdose, misuse and abuse. It provides us with challenges, but also opportunities for collaborations and synergies. And continuous pharmacovigilance is required to ensure that risk minimisation is relevant, effective and sustainable. Thank you very much for your attention.